They may not be citizens or have the proper documentation, but the vast majority of immigrants are not criminals. They pay taxes and are good neighbors. They are faithful members of our churches and mosques, synagogues, wadara, and temples. I ask you to have mercy, Mr. President, on those in our communities whose children fear that their parents will be taken away.
That was the Episcopal Bishop of Washington yesterday at the National Cathedral, talking directly to the president, directly, eye to eye, about compassion, humility, kindness, honesty, honoring the inherent dignity of every person, talking to him about respect, about mercy. This is not his usual bailiwick. It is hers, though. Joining us now is the Right Reverend Marianne Edgar Budde. She's the Episcopal Bishop of Washington, D.C. Bishop Budde, I really appreciate you making the time. I know you have a lot of options where to be, and I appreciate you being here.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
What made you decide to make that appeal the way you did, to ask him for mercy in that way?
Well, as you summarized so well, as I was thinking about at the end, toward the end of my preparation, the pillars of unity, it struck me that I was missing one, and that last one was mercy, to have mercy and compassion. And rather than state it in sweeping terms, I thought I would acknowledge to the president, acknowledge that he had come to the highest office of the land, that he had millions of people had entrusted him with this power. And I wanted to make, as you heard, a plea, a request that he broaden his characterization of the people that are frightened now and are at risk of losing everything. And I thought that that would be the more respectful way to say it, and also to appeal to not only the president, but to all who might be listening, to appeal to what we know to be true about our immigrant neighbors, who they are, the kind of people that we're blessed to be among, and to remember them in our understanding of what it means to be America.
Your opportunity in that moment to minister directly to the president is a very unique moment. I know that you've been the bishop in Washington for a long time, and you were there for his first inaugural as well. But I wanted to ask about the broader question of the role of the church right now in moral leadership in this moment. We have seen the Catholic Church, the Episcopal Church, elements of the Lutheran Church, other congregations all over the country, very diverse types of churches, offer themselves, for example, as sanctuaries for people who are facing deportation. What do you see as the role of the church in helping lead the public and helping us understand what our moral responsibilities are right now?
Right. That's a great question. I would say the first and primary role that we have is by example. You know, to take the teachings of our faith, to welcome the stranger, to love as we've been loved, to be compassionate, and to live that out in real terms with real people in our communities. So that's foundational. And then, when given the opportunity to speak and to be at times a conscience, at other times a consolation, to be present, ministering or pastoring the common good. And so it takes many forms. It depends on the moment. We're in a particularly harsh moment now when it comes to conversations around immigrant populations in our midst. And so that was the reason for the tone I took now. But it could have been a very different tone in a different context, depending on how compassion needs to be manifest in a given time.
Even before we had the sort of, you wouldn't use these terms, but I'll use it, sort of nasty reaction from the president in the overnight hours in which he demanded an apology from you and insulted you in personal terms. Even before we got that reaction from him, a lot of people were describing what you did as brave And I wanted to get your reaction to that. I mean, as a high-ranking church leader who's been doing this job for a long time, I imagine that speaking in public isn't difficult to you, and speaking on difficult truths isn't difficult for you. But what do you make of the fact that I think a lot of people are feeling, are seeing in you a form of courage that they hope they would have themselves? Well,
just a slight correction. I'm afraid every time I step into a pulpit, right? That really never goes away. Large or small, it doesn't matter. It's a huge responsibility, tremendous vocation, and how many people get that amount of time and uninterrupted speech, right? So it's a really big deal, and I take it very seriously every time. So yeah, I was nervous. I was scared. I think perhaps the reason why it had the effect that it did is because for a while now, there has been very little public, there hasn't been much of a narrative outside of the narrative that the president has been describing, right? People have gone quiet or they've been ignored. And so this was a moment, and I had no idea who was paying attention. I mean, the inauguration was the day before. There weren't that many people in the cathedral. It wasn't crowded. It was a group of people who had gathered at his invitation, but it wasn't something that was in public discourse. And so I think in some ways that was perhaps the reason why it had the effect that it did. It is also an audacious thing to address anyone directly from the pulpit. I typically do that for weddings, when you talk to a couple. Do you know what I mean? At funerals, you talk to the family you're seeking to console. This was a service of prayer for unity for the country, but it was on the occasion of the inauguration of a president. And if you go back to other sermons in those moments, there's almost always a word to the president. So it wasn't unusual in that way. But in the particular moment we're in, it filled a space that hadn't been occupied for a while.
Bishop Budde, I'd like to just ask you one last question, and sure. I'll give you from the outset an opportunity to not answer this if you don't want to, because it's perhaps not fair of me. Right. But we did get that nastygram from the president in the middle of the night, in which he did insult you and demand an apology. Yeah. And I know I've seen remarks that you made today that you've received a lot of not just invective but threats, including death threats, over the course of today since that happened. And I would just ask if you wanted to respond either to the president or to the people who have wished you ill in response to this.
Well, I've had people wish me dead. I'm not sure they've threatened to kill me, but they seem to be pleased if I met my eternal destiny sooner rather than later. And I would simply say I was trying actually to encourage a different kind of conversation, that you can certainly disagree with me, you can disagree what I've said or did, but could we as Americans and fellow children of God speak to one another with respect? I would offer the same to you. I would listen to your views and I would honor them, but we don't have to go to the highest extremes of contempt when we are in a position of disagreement. And I think if we could get that back as a country, we would go a long way in being able to work together to address the many problems that we face.
Well, at its best, no matter your religious faith or lack thereof, the ministry is both teaching and leading. Yeah. And that, I think, is why you're having such a strong reaction from so many Americans to what you did yesterday. And I am sorry for the vitriol and the negative reaction that you've had from some quarters, but I hope you know that there's a lot on the other side of that as well.
Thank you so much.
Marianne Budde, Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, D.C. It's an honor to have you here. Come back anytime.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.